and welcome to my 10th YouTube video. Yay! I'm starting to get the hang of this a bit, so I thought I might do something just a little bit different and show you how I go about getting a really smooth background with my colour pencils. So here we go. Alright, so for backgrounds I like to use the Prismacolor colour pencils. It's basically because they're very, very waxy and they put the pigment down on the paper really quickly. You could do this with any of the other artist grade colour pencils, but being a little bit harder, they take more layers to get as much pigment onto the paper. And I'm a little bit lazy, so I just like to get it done as fast as possible. For this black, what looks like a black background, I've used the indigo blue, the Tuscan red and the black pencil. When you layer those together, they just sort of create a more interesting black. It's a little bit deeper, it's a little bit more fun to look at than if it was just a black pencil on its own. Just a little bit more dynamic. And for the foreground, just so there's a little bit of difference between the front and the background, I've used the 70% and the 50% cool grey. I use an odourless solvent to break down the wax in the pencils, which allows me to push the pigment down into the tooth of the paper. This is by far too much. You really don't need to buy a big bottle like this. It's just that I've been experimenting with some oil painting lately and I just happen to have a whole ton of the stuff sitting around. I decant it into a little container like this. It's got a seal around the outside so that if I tip it, it won't spill out and make a big mess everywhere and put toxic stuff everywhere I don't want it. For my paper, I like to use the Fabriano Academia paper. This is very readily available at my local art store and it's not overly expensive. It's nice and sturdy and it has a tooth that I really enjoy. I don't like to have a paper that's too smooth because I find that the pigment just sort of slides around and I don't have the control that I like. The brushes that I use are a pair of Taklon oval brushes. I have a larger one and a smaller sort of size one there. I use the larger one for stabbing the pigment down into the tooth of the paper, and you'll notice this one's getting a little bit of a fluffy tip, and I'm finding that the more damage that gets, the better of a job it's doing at actually pushing the pigment down. And I have this nice little undamaged one with a smaller tip so I can get into the little cracks and stuff. And finally I have this super sexy MDF board in the background. I realise this is probably not the most attractive thing to have in the background of these videos, but I found the surface works as the perfect sponge to wick away any excess solvents from my brush so that I'm not overly wetting my paper. And that's it. So let's get on to the action. First up, I use a layer of my black pencil over the entire background. The most important thing here is to remember to keep a very, very light touch. The whole idea of this technique is to just get the pigment onto the paper so that I can use the thinners to push them down. I don't need to use the tip of the pencil to get down into those cracks because the thinner's going to do it for me. If I start getting heavy-handed, all I'm going to do is damage the paper and leave obvious lines, which is exactly what I'm trying to avoid. To force myself to keep that light hand, I hold the pencil further down the barrel and I only use the side of the pencil to put the pigment down on the paper. This means that I can't put the pressure on the tip of the pencil to flatten out the paper. I use large lazy circles to cover the surface. I don't need to be perfect. Remember, this is only the first coat. I have another 9 layers of pencil I think it took to get that really, really smooth coverage, so you don't have to stress about making it perfect on the first pass. This first layer took the longest. It took me a good hour on this A3 sheet of paper to cover the entire area I wanted black. I'm not going to make you watch that in real time. As tedious as it was to do, it's going to be even more tedious to watch, so let's speed on through to the next colour. And you can see after all that effort, I've ended up with something that looks like static on an old-fashioned TV. Which can be a little discouraging, but that's okay. This is just the first layer of many. Now I'm going to go over and do the same thing again with my indigo pencil. While I'm essentially using the same technique as I did on the first layer, I do try to pay attention to where I may have left some obvious directional lines on that first layer and try to go in the opposite direction just to try and smooth it out as much as I can. While this layer still takes a long time, it's not quite as tedious as the first because there's already something on the paper. And if you miss any spots or if there's any unevenness between the colours, it's just going to add to the interest of the background in the end. So once again, before I bore you to death, let's speed on through to the next layer. And now I go over it again doing the same thing with the Tuscan red. And now I'll put on one more coat of the black pencil before I start with the thinners. So far at this point I've been colouring for about 4 hours and I still have something that looks like bad static reception. But this is where we get to the fun part. So I've got this little piece of paper here prepared the same way to show you how I actually put the thinners to work. You can see after 4 layers of pencil that I've got little bits of pigment and wax built up on the ridges of the tooth of the paper, and I know now that I've got enough there to push down into the paper to get a nice solid black. What I'm going to do is dip my paintbrush into the thinners, sort of swipe it off on the side and get a little bit of the excess off, and then I use this MDF board. About 2 or 3 passes I find just takes off the perfect amount of thinners to leave me with a semi-damp sort of brush. Basically how I'm going to use this is to use a stabbing motion. So basically what I'm doing is using the thinners to melt the wax of the pencil, which then allows me to push the pigment down further into the valleys of the paper. And this covers up all those little white flecks that you can see. It takes a little bit of work and a lot of patience. And with a really nice sort of dark area. What I really don't want to do is to use too much of the thinners. If I don't wipe that off, I'm just kind of going to get inky puddles of pigment and it won't be smooth, and you can see it sort of pushing it out and away from where I want it to be. And I don't want to use a swirling motion. If I swirl, I'll get little areas where the pigment has been pushed to the outside. You can watch it dry just a little bit. It's not as obvious to the camera, but when you're looking up front, sort of pushing it around like that really doesn't give you the same dark depth as just stabbing it into the paper. This photo shows what it looks like after the thinners have dried, and you can really tell where the one area is just nice and solid and black, and where I've used too much of the thinners or I've pushed the pigment around too much, you've ended up with areas that are splotchy and uneven. And here's what it looks like in time-lapse as I do that over my whole piece. I do have to be careful where I get to the little tiny delicate bits around the flowers. I really don't want to smudge that black into the areas I want to keep white, because once that gets into the paper there is no erasing it, so I use my very small paintbrush to get into those bits. Chances are, to get really good coverage you'll need to go over and repeat this process several more times. Although you'll probably find that subsequent layers of pencil go down a lot easier and it takes a lot less time to cover the paper. I needed to repeat this process 3 times to get the result I was looking for, and it took me about 5 hours. But in the end I'm really happy with the piece, and I think it'll look really good in the end for the effort that I've put into the background. I hope you've enjoyed this and that it's been useful to you. Please let me know what you think by leaving a like or a comment, and if you'd like to see how this picture turns out, why not hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.